Welcome to the 71st edition of the Winter Show. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to have you all here today in partnership with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We're thrilled to have them to be doing this wonderful panel discussion, Cultural Custodians, How American Collections Preserve and Propel. The Winter Show is the world's longest consecutively running art, antiques, and design show in the world. What sets us apart from other art shows is that we are wholly owned by and we benefit Eastside House Settlement. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the National Trust's, there we go, Carol Quillen.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Carol Quillen, and I serve as the President and CEO of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I am quite new to this position and also new to the field. Most of my career, I'm a historian by training, and most of my career has been spent in higher education. So when I came to the National Trust, I was really drawn by the power of its mission. And at its broadest, what the National Trust does is protect the places and the artifacts that matter to our people and to our history. And I knew that's what our mission was when I arrived at the Trust, but I didn't understand the power of those words. I didn't understand the power of place to improve people's lives. And now when we talk about preservation, I try to stress the ways in which preservation makes things happen. We protect, we save, we safeguard the places that matter to our collective history and to our stories. But why? Why save these places? It's because of the powerful things that happen there, the powerful connections that we make with one another, the powerful stories that we're able to uncover, the ways in which we ourselves become storytellers as we connect to the artifacts and buildings and stories of the past. So it's an extraordinary privilege for me to be a part of that collective project, and we're grateful that you're here. And if I run into you at any point during the Winter Show, I'm sure to ask you your why of preservation, what brought you to the field, and why it matters to you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to our panel and to our moderator. Ellen, take it away.
Thanks so much, Carol. And what a Saturday evening crowd. This is so nice to see you all here. I am Ellen McGauley. I am the executive editor of Veranda magazine, which is actually based down in Birmingham, Alabama. You know, one of the reasons that I'm here is because Veranda considers preservation sort of a cornerstone of everything that we do, of our storytelling, of our editorial mission. And sometimes that sounds a little bit funny to me because, you know, after covering design for 20 years, how could it not be? Everything starts with this kind of invisible narrator, which is history. And so, you know, to talk about anything, whether it's architecture or decorative arts or interior design, it kind of all starts with historic precedent. And so some of that answers the question of why we do what we do, is looking forward and being able to talk with significance. Today, to talk about how America's collections preserve and propel us forward, I have three extraordinary panelists, and what makes them so extraordinary is that they aren't just experts and scholars in their fields. They are doers, they are change makers, their perspectives and their work are actively shaping society. So we're going to learn so much from them today. I'm going to briefly introduce each of them now, starting with right here to my left, my friend Brent Leggs, Executive Director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is the leading force for recognizing and safeguarding sites where pivotal moments of African American history happened. He is also the Senior Vice President of the National Trust and a good friend of ours at Veranda. Last time I saw him, we were in Birmingham together. Welcome. Our next panelist is Maria Nicanor. art historian, curator, and director of Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, right here in New York, up on 91st Street. Yes, the only U.S. museum devoted to historic and contemporary design. She is the steward of one of the most diverse and comprehensive design collections in existence, and you will love hearing from her. I certainly have. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you.
And David Scott Parker, architect, preservationist, Winter Show exhibitor, correct, trustee for the National Trust, and recipient of numerous prestigious awards and citations for his work to preserve historic residencies and properties. Any conversation with him is encyclopedic in nature. I feel like it's like a master class just even passing you in the hall, so it's wonderful to talk to you. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you.
Who better than to talk about their mission and their work and what they're doing and why than these panelists themselves. So, Brent, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you to talk about your mission, your work, and what's important to you right now.
As you heard, I have the good fortune of leading the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It's where we make an important and lasting contribution to the American landscape by preserving centuries of African American resilience, activism, achievement, and so much more. We leverage the power of place and historic preservation to have a positive impact in society. And in essence, our end goal is to build a true national identity that reflects America's diversity. I've got 3 points that I want to share to give context for the importance of this work. We believe at the National Trust for Historic Preservation that it is our ethical responsibility to equitably interpret American history so that we can expand the American story and that all social and ethnic communities can see themselves surrounded in the history in our local communities across the country. The second point, environmental stewardship. We protect and conserve cultural landscapes, historic architecture, and material culture, not only to tell stories, but we do that to sustain the links between the past and the present and to retain embodied energy. And third, collective responsibility. Through historic preservation, all of us across our nation can begin to build an ethic and increase the values of this work by preserving places like the childhood home of Nina Simone in Tryon, North Carolina. We are currently working to preserve this piece of vernacular architecture, this simple, unadorned, humble place, and the landscape as a tool for being able to celebrate her life and contributions. We believe that Nina Simone deserves a singular place where her legacy will endure. Or at a National Trust historic site in Louisiana, to be able to use an object to bring life and recognition to an enslaved workers at a historic plantation. Or right here in New York, where we're partnering with Dr. Prince, who owns the Langston Hughes House, and supporting her with a long-term stewardship plan around the protection of this handsome and elegant historic residence that embodies the creativity and spirit of American literary history. And those stories of the Harlem Renaissance and Langston Hughes are imbued in this historic fabric, architectural integrity, and objects like a typewriter. And last, if you get the opportunity to tour the Louis Armstrong House Museum in Queens, it is a National Historic Landmark and a special place that includes a Japanese-inspired garden, a historic house, and a Jetson blue light kitchen. This place holds memories that express and communicate Black romantic life, the legacy of a global icon in American music. So through those values and historic preservation, we can increase the educational, cultural, and financial value of historic assets important in American history.
And that's why I didn't decide to tell what they do myself. So we're just getting started here. Thank you, Brent. We're going to turn that over to Maria. Maria, if you would tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Thank you for having me here. Hi, I'm Maria Nicanor. I am personally an architectural historian. I am originally from Spain. Have always been interested in the world of architecture and design. And I am now the temporary steward of this place that you see up on the screen, the Cooper Hewitt, the Smithsonian Design Museum. I have found myself in museums as my medium for storytelling, to tell stories about architecture and design and how they shape our lives. And I'm very lucky that I get to be a part of this larger sort of Smithsonian family through this member of the family that is the one devoted to design. We are, of course, just a few blocks from here, up on Fifth Avenue and 90th Street. And we're located in the former Andrew Carnegie Mansion from the late 1800s. And because we're hosted today by our friends from the National Trust, I couldn't help myself but to sort of go back a little bit into the history of that building as well, which is in fact one of the main objects in our collection. At the Cooper Hewitt, we are the stewards of over 250,000 objects that tell the story of our lives through design. The house is one of them. And part of our mission is to tell these stories and to educate through the power of design and how it can change our lives, right? But it's always good to remind ourselves of the work that is the caretaking labor of not just the content of these institutions, but the institutions themselves. And although you get to see a lot of glamorous images sometimes of the exhibitions, this is a lot of what happens behind the scene to take care of the bones of these historic places, these historic homes that need love and need care and leak. This is you probably would leak too if you were over 100 years old. So we often are just covered in physical and conceptual scaffolding in these institutions as well. And it's a big part of the job that we do. I consider myself lucky because historic preservation is one of my passions from when I was a student. And I've always been very interested in reusing old spaces for new contemporary art spaces. So it's sort of the luckiest thing that one can do is to work in a space like this and take care of the collection. The collection of the Cooper Hewitt, which again is one, of course, you all know here, but one of the over 21 museums of the Smithsonian network, including the National Zoo. We are one of two that is in New York, that is not situated in Washington, D.C., in the mall. We're sort of like the cool New York cousin that is up here. And we take care of a collection that is not just American, the collection is international and global in scope. It goes and covers and spans over 31 centuries. It starts with the oldest piece in our collection, which is the Egyptian faience cup from 1100 BC that you see on the screen. It goes all the way to born digital objects, such as the COVID-19 model that you see on the screen, that a lot of the images that you know well from 2020 were started from this particular model, which is about this size. So our collection spans everything in between these two objects, all of it. And all of that is sort of the fabric of our lives, right? It's represented in our museum through 4 foundational departments: wallpapers, textiles, drawings, prints, and graphic design, and product design. And more recently, in 2023, we added, for the first time in 125 years in the history of the institution, a fifth department to add digital as a department so that we could start housing our digital collection there as well. So one of the big things that we're looking forward to in the next few years at the museum is to bring all of this collection out on view. I say all. Of course, cultural institutions often cannot share the entirety of their collection. We're lucky we can share and put out on view and share with others 1% of what we have. But one of the big projects that we have is to take everything that is in boxes right there. This is an image of our storage facility in an undisclosed location, not too far away from the Cooper Hewitt. So the big project for us is to bring this collection out so more people can have access to it, mostly because it is a public national collection funded by your taxpayer dollars. So in fact, all of this collection is yours. This is your collection. And in that sense, we feel a great sense of responsibility of sharing it and telling the stories that are represented by the objects in it. So I hope that throughout the conversation, I can share that shared value of like the ownership in a national collection and what it means as opposed to some other collections that you might be familiar with, and instill in you this sense of ownership of what your national collection is and how you can shape it too.
Thank you so much. To frame it in the story of our life is so inspiring and demonstrative about that. David, let's hear from you about your work.
Thank you. Well, I'm David Parker. I am a practicing architect, also an interior designer, and also a gallerist, having exhibited here at the Winter Antique Show for 14 years. Some of you may remember our gallery, which is called Associated Artists, a name that those of you who know the Armory well know was a group that figured prominently in the design of some of the spaces here. I am a bit unusual in that I am an architect who also cares about objects. And I'm also an architect that is interested in the past and the future, which it seems like a total non sequitur. And people often ask me, what do you mean? Well, the only way I can explain that is by explaining that I grew up in a town of 1,000 people in the Midwest, a town called New Harmony, which some of you may have heard of. And New Harmony was this really unusual utopian idealist community in the middle of America in the early 19th century, a place that was very interested in looking to the future. And now then, New Harmony is something in the past. And I grew up as the town was being restored. So by the time I finished graduate school, I had actually worked on the restoration of over 30 buildings. Actually, New Harmony is extraordinary because it has a building by Philip Johnson, which is called the Roofless Church. And the visitor center was designed by Richard Meyer. And I had the fortune of meeting Richard and being his gopher when he would come out. And I have continued to have this interest, this dual interest in the past and the future. My interest in objects is something that I've had throughout my entire life. The gallery Associated Artists is very much about the aesthetic movement. That's the period that you see on the screen in front of you here. I've titled this Collections as a Moment in Time. And I thought what I would speak to today, because many of you here are collectors, and I thought it would be useful to speak to why do people collect, what makes a collection important, and how to best preserve and interpret those collections. The way that used to be done across America, and there are 15,000 of these across the United States, is in historic house museums, which typically are a moment in time. Now, this is not a historic house museum. This is actually a private residence. But in this case, the owners chose to interpret a particular period, and it actually runs through the entire house. I wanted to draw the distinction between moment in time versus connoisseurship and collections, which is a different way of thinking about objects and the dialogue that objects have with one another. And in this case, many of the things in this collection were collected, and it's all about the extraordinary quality of the pieces, and many of the pieces here are the most important examples of work by Louis Comfort Tiffany, including his aquamarine vase, perhaps the most important vase by Tiffany, shown next to a Rothko painting, which is undersea ballet or something like that, I think it's called. But there's a dialogue between the objects. And one thing that designers are always thinking about is how pieces go together. The old way of thinking about that was, we have to copy what they did and you just put everything there from that time. But the thing about objects is objects can transcend time. Objects speak to us, and objects have stories that are about the aesthetic, but they're also about the intrinsic quality of those pieces. And another thing about these particular pieces is that most of these are already promised to museums where they will actually be shared with the public. And that's actually a wonderful way to think about connoisseurship, is that we are the custodians of these pieces now, but how can we share them in the future? And that's something that the National Trust for Historic Preservation does in all of its work. And I wanted to also speak to the changing way that we interpret buildings. And what I'm showing you here is a current project of ours. This is the oldest house in Newport, Rhode Island. It was built in 1697, which is quite extraordinary. It was also one of the very first National Historic Landmarks in the entire United States. Made a National Historic Landmark for its importance architecturally and for its early date. A recent discovery at this property changed the way that we think about this as a National Historic Landmark. And that was the discovery fairly recently of an inkisi, which is a sacred bundle, identified mainly with people from the Congo. And this is the only time in all of New England that an inkisi, which was to protect its owner through the voyage of life, has turned up. And so that tiny bit of DNA actually changes the way that we think of this property. And the fact that this building dates from 1697, which is essentially exactly the same, it coincides with the arrival of the first slave ship in Newport, and makes us realize that the economy of Newport, and most people don't realize this, was founded on slavery. And so this touchstone moment gives us an ability to see this property in a new way. Objects are not static, neither are buildings, but that we do have a responsibility to preserve them and to share them. And these things are important. These things need to be relevant in order to be saved. And then I wanted to end on a slide of a property of the National Trust. I'm thrilled to be involved with the National Trust and very proud of our properties. This is one of our properties that is really extraordinary. It's called Chesterwood, and it was the home of the sculptor Daniel Chester French. You all know his most important work, which speaks to us artistically, it speaks to us culturally and socially, and it is something that the Trust is very, very proud of. And Chesterwood not only maintains the maquette for that statue, but most of the maquettes that Daniel Chester French did. And so this is really a connoisseurship of collection, but it's maintaining collections in situ as opposed to assembling them. And by the way, Chesterwood, you see the studio in the lower right corner, was designed by Henry Bacon, who subsequently would design the Lincoln Memorial. The National Trust also maintains the Lincoln Cottage, where Abraham Lincoln penned the Emancipation Proclamation. And the National Trust is extraordinary in the breadth and width of things that it does to make our past relevant. So with that, I will say thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for you've really kind of brought it together. We all know why we're here. We're all kind of very passionate. The National Trust, we've really brought a lot of that together with why we do what we do. We're going to be talking a lot about value. And Maria, I want to start with you. You, as you're acquiring collections and really digging into these objects, can you tell us a little bit more about how do you calculate and assign value? What determines value?
Calculate is an interesting word, as this value, as this worthiness. All of these are words of power and control and decision making, right? Who gets to decide sort of holds the baton. I mean, I'm going to speak from the perspective of a national collection, of course, which is very different to the perspective of a private collection, of a personal collection. And there's certainly ways, processes in place in which museums acquire works, right? There's practical consideration, processes, certainly values that is monetary. But I wouldn't say that for us the monetary value is the guiding principle of deciding how a piece comes into the national collection. We focus more on the stories and the people that those objects or ideas might represent so that we can appropriately represent a moment in time, right? So we recently did an exhibition at the museum that was called Acquired, and it showed the ways in which a national collection is formed, right? Especially when you also have a foundational collection that started with different values than the ones that we might have today. When the collection of Cooper Hewitt was amassed by the Hewitt sisters in the 1800s, the meaning of design, probably they didn't call it design, they used different words, was very different. What design meant then is not what design means now. So we looked at the lens of the show to try to explain how do we even deal with adding objects to a collection and changing the values of that. And we decided that there were three sort of like guiding principles that were helpful to us. One of them was embracing the past. So this is more like a concept of addition to what you already have and the importance of stories in the past. There was another one that was confronting the past. I have things in my collection that have really difficult stories to tell. And the reasons and the rationale of why they came into the collection could be questioned and are questioned, and we question them all the time. And we try to interpret those stories. And then the third one is sort of like looking new ways forward, right? Like what are the new themes that are defining our times and how do we need to represent that in the collection? So in that sense, we put monetary value aside and take this sort of like sense of responsibility, for the nation. It sounds very cumbersome, to decide what is going to be passed on in this sort of business of longevity that we're in.
The story sounds like is a very strong part of it, which brings me to you, Brent. Thank you, Maria. You have hundreds of historic sites, whether I believe they're across the board, residences, civic buildings, churches that come across your desk and for grants, for preservation, for landmarking, right? How do you determine worthiness? Because you got some choices to make, right?
Yeah, some hard choices. So since launching the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, we have invested $30 million in 323 preservation projects nationwide. It's pretty cool. Yeah. And that's being led by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It is a challenging process to actually curate stories through the power of place in this portfolio. What's interesting about the churches, the buildings on the campuses of historically Black colleges and universities, the residences, swimming pools. I mean, it's such a diverse archetype representing.
Rec centers, you mean?
Yeah, community centers, literally swimming pools, the Charles McAfee swimming pool in Kansas City. This collection represents broadly our nation's civic identity, and we understand our responsibility in curating African American communities' values through this portfolio. So my team has a really fun process of using historic preservation to empower grassroots and property owners who are the ones that are the daily caretakers and stewards of these historic places. And so in essence, they're the ones defining what place matters in history. They're the ones that's organizing and investing their resources. That's the reason I showed Nina Simone's house, because it's representative of the majority of African American historic places. That the objects that we saw on the screen that are high style, most African American places don't have that kind of furnishing and objects. The collection includes the architecture, the landscape, and the stories. And so we understand that holistically, when we help to conserve those three things as a trifecta, then we're starting to be able to have a story that has meaning and power.
And it sounds to like you're trying to expand your circle of stakeholders as well when you're involving more of the people that are in the communities as well. So would that be accurate?
That is accurate. We work with artists, descendants, families, institutions. The collective responsibility and the equitable interpretation is the charge that we have for the institutions like the National Trust. You all know that we're celebrating our 75th year. If we look at the evolution of our organization, we did not start by centering diverse communities in the places that we interpreted or helped to preserve. But more recently, we are living up to our organizational mission and value by having an African American Culture Heritage Action Fund, by launching a Chinatown initiative, by having a program associated to where women made history. For us, we are wanting to live up to our mission, which is to tell the full American story.
Thank you, Brent. David, I'm going to turn to you, and as a preservationist and a dealer, I mean, an antiques dealer, can you talk about how you see collectors are assigning value and what influences this and what's changed over the past however many, 5, 10, years, 20 years?
Well, collectors and many of you in this room would fall into that category. Generally are looking for rarity. They are looking at condition. They are looking at style, and they are looking at beauty, however you want to define beauty, which is relative. And the lens that we look at that through has changed dramatically. And if you speak to the dealers on the floor, you can have long conversations with them about this, because value does change over time. Monetary value, I'm talking about monetary value, and that is not the only value, by the way. But the value assigned to these pieces ebbs and flows with taste, and it's also influenced by change in decor and aesthetics, because for years and years and years, people would come here and find exquisite pieces for their home, right? And the piece needed to fit into their area of interest. And in the age of the internet, that has changed. And also the Historic House Museum, which when the National Trust for Historic Preservation was created, was something that people took for granted. And it was almost like you create it, they will come. That model is not necessarily valid in a universal way anymore. And so one of the things about the National Trust and its objects is that the trust is constantly mining its sites and its histories to find points of tangency and to find ways to make things relevant, because there needs to be a dialogue, not just with the objects, but with the people. And you or people who come there need to understand why this matters to them at a very kind of essential level.
We're talking about connection, right?
Connection,
yeah.
That's connection. A lot of younger people don't really want to own possessions. They instead value experiences. And so that's one way in which museums can actually change the way that you present, because you can offer an experience. And it's like, wow, that was an amazing place to go. But they don't necessarily need to own it. So there are evolving ways that we relate to objects and to collections, and it does change over time, and it does change the value.
But it's about establishing that connection, is what it sounds like to me, however we do it. Brent, you talked about a holistic approach to preservation. And in your work in telling America's full story, moving properties into a new era, can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by a holistic approach and how that's a little bit different?
So when I first got started in historic preservation, started with the National Trust in 2005, and we used language like preservation, develop a preservation plan, develop a master plan. We weren't thinking holistically around the work of stewardship. And so we're now beginning to use different language for the way that we approach preservation practice, and are thinking more holistically about the resources needed to sustain the preservation of objects, architecture, landscapes, and the stories imbued within. And we do that through the intentional engagement of community members. And over the last, I'd say, 5 years, it's exciting that historic preservation is having a cultural renaissance. It's like our society realizes the collective responsibility of equitable interpretation. And for us, it's been really exciting to see more African Americans move from conducting preservation work on an informal basis into formal preservation practice and be empowered to do the work, as you said, David, to create connections, but also to activate historic spaces that allows the public to have unique educational and cultural experience.
Thank you. And jumping off of that, a lot of what we've talked about and why we all are interested in preservation, or why it's important, is about making sure that those lessons carry forward, the lessons of the past carry forward. And that's why we kind of do some of this. David, can you talk about how some of these properties or even objects can impart lessons and the living, breathing part of this, such as what Brent's talking about as well?
I mean, if we look at the slide here, for example, that doesn't need explanation. In some cases, though, people need to be focused and understand why this matters, and that's what the Trust does. There was a sense of insecurity that prevailed in America until we finally were of age, which was in 1876. 1876, there was an amazing exposition in Philadelphia called the Centennial Exposition, and that was the beginning of American multiculturalism. And it also was the beginning of a new sense of confidence. So no longer did we have to have a building that looked like our English ancestors or our in-laws' French ancestors, but suddenly there was a broader perspective because exposure to objects, and that's what the Philadelphia Exposition did, opened people's eyes. And so that was a watershed moment. And by the way, that period was not only the beginning of multiculturalism in America, it was also the beginning of eclecticism in design. I mean, if you think about that, that's quite extraordinary. Because this notion that objects from different cultures, from different eras, can speak to one another and they can speak to us. That is the power of objects, and that is where we as a culture can help define who we are more broadly. And that is something I'm very proud of with the Trust. If you look at our portfolio of properties and our hopefully expanding portfolio of properties, it is the entire American experience and who we are as a collective.
As a writer, I love hearing about when the world opens up to a new story. That is so inspiring to me and helps me look at preservation in a whole different way. Similar question to you, Maria, about how, if you can think of any examples or if there's any moments where, an object can impart a lesson from an era or values from an era, and we kind of move forward with that.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I look at it almost is as looking at these objects as almost excuses for a conversation. And you can tell the history of the world if you want from any object, anything. Like we could start here. And you could tell the history of the world from this object. This object, you can also go up to MoMA and you can see it in a vitrine as a regular, everyday object, regardless of the value that we were talking about before, right? So I see it as an opportunity to tell our stories and to create time capsules, if you will. If you think of your own personal collections, what would those collections tell about you, right? What would those collections tell about your life, who you are? What would they not tell about you? What would not be represented in the story of your life? So I'm interested in that time capsule value as well. And then in finding the unusual object to start the conversation as well. Sometimes we judge the object by its beauty. Sometimes we judge it by a different kind of value, the craft, the masterpiece of it. But we have objects in the collection, for example, that have joined the collection recently. I'll pick one, maybe though there are many, that tell larger stories. And it's really not about the object. The object is almost insignificant. So we brought into the collection, for example, the first digital camera that was a wearable that the police is wearing in the United States, for example. It's a tiny little thing, smaller than your iPhone. They clip it onto their uniforms, and suddenly everything is recorded. So I'm not that interested in that actual camera, but I'm interested in what that says about the moment, the stories that are represented, what it all meant in our collective imaginary when we learned that this was a new thing. So if you look at it that way, I think that starts to reflect the values of an era. And you don't necessarily need to collect just the values that you agree with. That's not our responsibility. In our sense, we are a bipartisan institution in that sense. We need to make sure that all the values of that era are represented, right? So I think that's the sense of responsibility that I feel when I look at these objects and how we represent them, because they're telling the moments that we're living, and they say a lot about us.
Yeah, that gives a lot to think about. It's again with the decisions that you all make every day of just what and to something Brent's talked about, telling the full story. This might be the topic of the discussion here that at hand is that the next generations will study what we valued. You know, looking at the work of the National Trust and the Action Fund and of the Smithsonian and others. How does that shape what you do, or how can that help crystallize what you do? I'm going to start with you, David, on that, on what we do, meaning the things that you're doing now that will be studied later, what kind of values might those impart, and what opportunities are there?
One of the things about architecture is the intersection of science and art. And so what is a given is that the building has to stand up. You don't want it to leak. And a lot of what they teach you in architecture school is about things like that. And then you learn the history of architecture. The thing that I find about architecture is, and I try not to copy past styles. We do work on historic structures. I'm an architect, but I'm also a preservationist. And a preservationist understands that you don't want to do harm, but at the same time, you don't want to slavishly copy, right? And at various times in our history, people have gotten really constipated with slavishly copying the past. That's not meaningful.
It's inanimate, isn't it?
It's dead on arrival. It's dead on arrival. And the important thing for objects and the important thing for architecture is that it has to be relevant. So architecture speaks to its particular moment, and it's difficult to be objective about that. I don't try to do things that are new. I try to do things that are appropriate to the program, to the place, that respond to the client. Because with architecture, you don't have a building if you don't have a client. And one of the things the way I've always looked at architecture, because we're dealing with private clients mostly, with institutional clients, what we really don't do is we don't really work for developers, because that is commoditizing the product. A good tailor can make a suit of clothes that fits. A better tailor understands the fabric and how it drapes and how you can cut it and how you seam it. The best tailor does a suit of clothes that you are comfortable in, because the clothes are about you. So when we're doing buildings, it's not about me, it's about you. So the relevance becomes becomes self-evident through that design process, and it is a process. See, that's the whole thing. Design does not live or does not exist in space. It is a constant dialogue, and that's really what I enjoy about design. But and that's what I like about looking at the past, is understanding how that came to being, because it's not in a vacuum.
And that will certainly show an impact in the future. Brent, same question about what you're doing now and the work you're doing now will be looked at, and what we'll say about our values. Do you see it as sort of righting a ship and kind of moving a ship more in the right direction? Tell me how you see it.
I think that you can measure
and tell what a society values by what it preserves. And in this current moment, given the role of the National Trust for Historic Preservation in advocating across the country that we need to more equitably interpret the full American story, that we're creating a more representative heritage environment to increase recognition and to have other diverse communities to kind of celebrate the acknowledgement of their contribution in American history. But the purpose of that work is so that we create a more informed and knowledgeable society, so that we can use historic places to inspire creativity and passion. And the last point is we need to use the power of place to demonstrate our collective humanity and to facilitate empathy.
Very well said. Thank you for that. I was just thinking about it's both lofty and necessary as you're talking about how we might like actually look back and say this is when it changed, you know. Maria, you've said a few things about as in previous conversations that we had that were really inspiring as we talk about what people might study later or be able to see about our values now. And you have some ideas when it comes to building and what we might do differently today.
Yeah, and I partly touched on it when I was talking about this idea of the time capsule, right? What is it going to say about our future? And it's such a simple concept when we bring it home and we think about ourselves and our families and our homes. Would you think of not preserving your belongings and your homes or the things that you care for your family? You wouldn't take a second to think about. And yet it is so complicated sometimes to explain why we are preserving these objects, buildings, sets of systems and ideas for the preservation of the values of our country. And I see the same simplicity and the same sort of like common sense in having to do both of them, right? It's equally important. But I would say that, you know, one of the main things that we all share here, I think, is that we're all really trying to be of our time. We're trying to be relevant to our time. And if we think about what it means to be of our time now, if I pick architecture like you did, which is close to my heart and my expertise, what will be remembered in terms in the future when people look at this moment? Will it be the new building that was built? And I don't think that will be or should be the case. I think that's where the National Trust is actually at the cutting edge, what the future is, because it's about preserving. It's not about new buildings. I don't think we should be building new buildings at all. I'll just say that. Not entirely true. I don't believe that entirely. But it's important. It's more cutting edge to think about preserving than it is to think about building right now. So we have to just shed this idea that historic preservation is an old dusty field for just a few that care about the old things. It's the cutting edge of what the world needs right now, not just because we're taking care of the object, but because I think what we're all sort of like showing here is that the values and what you're pushing us to talk about really is the ideas behind it, right? So I would say that that's, you know, that gets me excited about the future and what we can do. Yeah.
What you've just said right here, what all three of you panelists have just said is instilling the connection in me, the storytelling here to remember. I remember, Maria, when you first said that, and I've been thinking about it ever since, the idea of like, this might be the era of, I think we even said like more like repurposing rather than building. And I'm in an industry where we're talking about new buildings. I mean, we're obviously talking about old buildings and renovating, but you know, a lot of what we're talking about is building. So it was kind of like this moment for me. And so I appreciate you kind of making that pivot. I would like to open it up to questions, I think, because again, and not one of my 700 more, because I could go on. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for a great conversation. You can probably tell that I'm not American, so I have this slightly different lens, and I'm interested to know what your relationship is to the English language and whether you think the conversation around preservation is the one we should be having at this moment. Is there a limitation in the term in terms of itself, or is there another language which more acutely captures your ambition with regards to reframing, looking after, caring, stewarding for the past?
we've thought about that and had discussions internally and with colleagues and stakeholders. We were shifting. So historic preservation has so many connotations, and I think the public understands it as a movement of no. And we were thinking that, in essence, what we are preserving is culture, and that cultural preservation might be a more relevant and contemporary way of describing the work that we do. And it's an ongoing conversation. I am on the side of recentering it back to historic preservation, not only because we have the Historic Preservation Act, and it's part of our regulatory system and the structures and the way that we protect historic places legally, but it's also a tool, and it depends on the community that you're speaking with. But right now we're in a phase of tradition, I would say.
I'll add something to that. I'm not a native English speaker. My native tongue is Spanish, and there's similar words in Spanish that represent the idea of preservation. Restauración, conservación, so restoration, conservation. But even those words have an issue that I think preservation has, which is this idea of freezing in time, perhaps. I'm more interested in words in any language, like repair, for example. And because that almost involves a continued use of this thing that you're repairing. You're not freezing it in time and shoving it in a glass vitrine and not ever having a relationship with it, but you're taking care of it for its continuation in some sort of way. So I think the word repair, in English, it has a connection with the word reparation, which I realize has a different meaning in English as well than it does in Spanish. But I'm interested in the concept of repair, perhaps conceptually more, and it's a bit more flexible and fluid than preservation, perhaps.
Sustainability and preservation are not one and the same. I would argue that people who are interested in sustainability should be thinking more about preservation. And actually, preservation is the ultimate form of sustainability, because it preserves not just the materials, but also the collective memory that goes into these places. And so, in being sustainable, it's also about finding new uses for old buildings. And if we're talking about the museum world, we're looking at the various trust properties in different ways to make those properties relevant, different ways to interpret them, different ways to use them, because the frozen in time model isn't necessarily the same, doesn't have the same impact, and it doesn't speak to people in a way that really resonates.
That's a great point. Other questions? Yes, right here.
I was wondering about whether the National Historic Trust has connections with local charitable organizations or nonprofits to help with sustainability for housing that is perhaps not of national importance or something. I'm from Memphis, and what's happened there has been really tragic. Beautiful homes that were built in the 20s and 30s and 40s prior to, World War II. People don't have the money to maintain them. And it's heart-wrenching. So I was just wondering if the National Trust has any means of connecting local places with sustainability help.
I'll put it into the context of our 75th anniversary. Part of our responsibility is to create preservation infrastructure around the country so that we can support preservation activities at the statewide and local level. And so over the decades, we've helped to establish statewide and local nonprofit organizations that have the responsibility that you described. We've worked with Historic Claiborne Temple in Memphis, associated to Dr. King and the sanitation workers strike, and have directed a lot of resources there and other properties. We invest in municipalities and nonprofits. And we are currently having conversations around developing toolkits and resources for private property owners to help with simple activities of how do you maintain and restore your windows. Yeah. How do you treat your historic wood floors? And techniques that will help, hopefully, property owners to be able to stay on top of the maintenance. Because one of the big issues is if you don't have a cyclical maintenance plan and the years of deferred maintenance pile up, then the cost of renovating and maintaining a building can become a challenge for property owners. So, but thank you for that.
I was going to, we haven't talked about, and I'm not with the trust, so I can't speak to what the trust does in this area, but we've been talking about preservation, and maybe to the point, to Jaden's point of the wording, we haven't talked about what happened in LA and in circumstances like that, for example, the most recent ones. Then the word really is adaptation, and how we're not going to rebuild those places in the same way that they were before, and we would be fools if we did. So how can we help adapt not just the crown jewels, but the everyday is important too, right? So I think there's a lot of work for everybody to do. And we all play a role in that. Perhaps from my museum, sort of like raising the consciousness of the importance to adapt to what's coming. In that sense, the trust will play another role. You know, there's different roles for all of us to play in that big task at hand, which is really to adapt, yeah.
I think that just about wraps it up. I want to thank you all for spending your early evening with us. What a full house. Thank you so much. And I want to extend huge thanks to the National Trust for bringing us all together. All of us, seems like, has a shared goal. And to these extraordinary panelists who are teaching us every day and through their work are making a difference. So I want to thank you all so much for being here. Thank you.